My wife went out for a romantic dinner with her boss, and I unexpectedly showed up at their table. When she saw me, her reaction was one of suppressed panic, like someone caught between desire and shame. I didn't need to say anything. I just got up and left, taking with me the certainty that this was the end. There were no screams, no slaps, no tears. There was only her gaze, trying to hide what was already clear, and the cruel silence of my abandonment. That image stuck in my retina for days, weeks, months, as if the seconds had been frozen inside my soul. The waiter paralyzed beside me, the wine glass she set down, half shaking, the too casual posture of the man with her, feigning naturalness as he swallowed his embarrassment. But what haunted me most was the way she seemed to lose herself there, as if in that instant she realized the exact magnitude of the mistake she was making. And yet, she said nothing. Neither she nor I. I just got up, paid the entire bill, and left without looking back, carrying with me a shattered heart and an irreversible certainty: what existed between us was over. In the days that followed, her silence hurt me more than any justification. And when she finally appeared, with red eyes and a blouse that still smelled of our closet, mumbling apologies and torn vows of repentance, I was no longer the same man. Something in me had died that night. It wasn't just love. It was respect, surrender, shelter. She said things like, "It wasn't what you think," but her eyes, oh, her eyes. They begged for forgiveness before her mouth even uttered a word. I listened, silent, to every explanation, every attempt to justify the unjustifiable, and silently I responded, "You destroyed everything. And no matter what you say now, ashes don't reassemble into a fireplace." She told me it wasn't love, that it had been need, curiosity, impulse, and then, regret. She said he left her soon after, that he didn't want anything serious, that she was a mistake for him. But what about me? What was I to you when you decided to sit at that table? An absence? A burden? Or just someone you thought would always be there, even after the fall? I walked around the house, and everything screamed her name. The cracked cup she wouldn't throw away, the flip-flop in the corner of the sofa, the books with random bookmarks. There wasn't a place where my pain didn't breathe. But I refused to beg for respect. And it was in the midst of this emptiness that I realized that, as much as it hurt, I needed to go. I needed to lose her to find myself. And, little by little, I began to live again. I went for aimless walks, sat on park benches, talked to strangers. I forced myself to smile at the days, until they began to smile back. I met someone by accident. Someone who promised nothing but delivered everything effortlessly. It wasn't a sudden love, it was a calm affection, a gentle presence, a gaze that didn't judge me for being betrayed. This new person didn't cure me of the previous pain, but showed me that there was life beyond it. Time passed. I changed. And one day, as if in an inevitable cycle, she reappeared. It was a different context, a different setting, but her eyes were the same. She looked at me as if rediscovering a lost piece of her own history. She sat across from me and spoke with a sweetness she'd never had before. She said she forgave me for leaving, and that she understood. That she thought of me every day. That no hug felt as home as mine. And, for the first time, I didn't cry when I heard that. I forgave her. Not because I still loved her, but because I no longer needed to hate her to move on. I said I wished her well, but that our time was up. She smiled with wet eyes, perhaps thinking there was still room for us. And that was when she saw. She saw who was beside me. She saw the intertwined fingers, the knowing look, the comfortable silence between me and another woman. And there, in that moment, the penny dropped with a crash. I felt in the air. She realized that returning was no longer possible. That the place she had left empty was now filled, and with something better, truer, more just. I never needed to scream for revenge. I never needed to rub my happiness in her face. Life did that for me. It taught me that you don't destroy those you love out of curiosity, and that certain choices cost too much. The betrayal wasn't just a secret kiss, it was an emotional abandonment, a rupture of the invisible sacredness that exists between two people who truly give themselves. And this rupture was too deep to be mended. She lost more than a partner. She lost the version of herself that existed with me, that flourished by my side. And no attempt to rescue that would be enough. And when she tried to love another, she realized she was searching in all of them for something that only existed in me. A touch, a gesture, a delicacy that she broke without realizing it. There were nights when she dreamed of me and woke with an empty pillow, crying softly in the dark. There were encounters she avoided because she knew she couldn't look me in the eye. And there were times when she almost called me, but didn't. Because she knew I was already in another time, in another life. At peace. And it was this peace that hurt her the most. Not my anger. Not my pain. But my serene indifference, my final goodbyes said in silence. Some people spend their lives trying to fix what they destroyed with choices that lasted 5 minutes. And they live forever with the memory of what they lost. That was her punishment, living with the certainty that she had everything, and traded it for nothing. And when she realized this, it was too late. But what hurt her most, and what no one saw, was the day she understood that, even though she had asked for forgiveness and received my compassion back, I was no longer there. That she no longer lived within me. That her love had finally become a thing of the past. And yet, there's one last thing she never knew. One last scene. Something that stayed with me, and that perhaps would explain why it took me so long to give myself up again. Something that will only be revealed at the right time, when everything is before her eyes, and she finally understands the full price of betrayal. Because sometimes, the cruelest consequence isn't being left. It's being forgotten. And there's a memory, a gesture, an unspoken goodbye that to this day haunts every step she takes. But if she had known this, would she have done it differently? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, created to show in an intense and realistic way how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Prepare to dive into deep, painful, and unforgettable narratives. The moral here is clear: whoever exchanges true love for an impulse pays a high price. Now take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear next is shocking. Daniel was the kind of man who went unnoticed by those who saw him from afar, but who left a deep mark on those who decided to truly get to know him. He had a calm gaze, an almost ancient patience in his words, and a way of listening that made the person on the other end feel like, for the first time in their life, they were truly being heard. He was a dedicated engineer, methodical with small habits, the kind who always folds his shirts the same way and has a favorite cup even for normal days. What most caught people's attention about him wasn't what he said, but the way he remained present. He didn't engage in shallow conversation or empty promises. He offered presence, constancy, and that, for those who knew how to see, was rare. When he met Laura, it wasn't with fireworks or grand gestures. It was simple, calm, almost silent. She arrived as if she didn't need to prove anything, and yet she filled every space. She had a strong laugh, a lightness in her step, and an energy that drew attention even when she wasn't trying. Laura was passionate about people, stories, and possibilities. A natural communicator, she worked at an event production company and lived amidst emails, meetings, and unfinished coffees. Her day started early and ended late, but she never failed to find time for a good wine or a conversation about life. He had a natural talent for transforming the ordinary into beauty, the simple into unforgettable. She liked flowers in the kitchen, music in the shower, and texts in the middle of the afternoon. When she met Daniel, she found him too restrained, almost predictable. But it was precisely this predictability that began to enchant her. He was the opposite of the rush that characterized her routine. And, over time, that silent man became her safe haven, her reference point for home amidst the chaos. Their relationship wasn't born of overwhelming love, but of a daily construction that seemed to be strengthened by small choices. One bought bread, the other made coffee. One forgot a wet towel, the other picked it up without complaint. One listened, the other spoke. And so they went, dividing their time and creating a routine that, to the eyes of those looking from the outside, seemed solid, calm and happy. The apartment where they lived reflected this construction, no excessive luxury, but delicacy in every corner. Curtains chosen by both partners, paintings hung with stories, books jumbled on the shelves, and souvenirs from travels adorned the living room. On Sundays, they would prepare lunch together, with soft music in the background and soft conversations about the week ahead. Sometimes they argued over small things, like the right way to fold napkins or the best route to the grocery store, but they never went to sleep without resolving something. It was as if they both knew that the stability they had was something the outside world tried to steal every day, and so they cared for it with affection. Laura, despite all her independence and restless spirit, liked to come home to find Daniel on the couch, a book on her lap and a space always reserved for her. And he, in turn, found in her the breath of life that lifted him from the rigidity of his own confines. They worked, despite being so different. Or perhaps precisely because of that. Time passed, and life moved on. Daniel remained true to his principles, always seeking to understand more about others than to impose his own vision. He was the kind of man who remembered important dates without needing a reminder, who made a point of being present in moments when no one else thought they mattered. He attended Laura's work presentations even without understanding half of what she said, and she smiled every time he showed up with an unprompted flower or a simple dinner on ordinary days. It was gestures like these that filled the silences between them. But Laura's world was constantly in flux. New projects, short trips, dinners with clients, important events always arose. Daniel never complained. He understood that her brilliance lay, in part, in this rhythm. And even when he spent nights waiting for her arrival, a lingering kiss and an "I'm sorry I'm late" were enough to make him forget his watch. Deep down, he knew that loving someone like Laura was accepting that love would come amidst the rush, not despite it. Still, there was something subtle that was slowly creeping in. It wasn't exactly distance, but a kind of gap between glances, a pause between touches, a weariness that came not from the body, but from the soul. Laura was beginning to lose herself in her own thoughts, too distracted even to notice Daniel watching her with eyes trying to understand what was changing. She told him it was just the rush, that everything was fine, that he didn't need to worry. And he, true to his way of loving, chose to believe. But the heart has its own language, and even the quietest can hear when something is starting to fail. Sunday dinner was replaced by last-minute meetings. The flowers received were less enthusiastic. The hugs lingered less. And yet, Daniel persisted. Because that was what he knew how to do: care, endure, remain. Mutual friends noticed the change discreetly. They didn't comment openly, but they exchanged glances at social gatherings, realizing that their previous rapport now seemed more rehearsed. Laura remained kind, smiling, and fun. But there was a certain weariness in her gestures, a restlessness that hadn't existed before. And Daniel, even noticing everything, chose silence as a way of loving. He believed that every bad phase passed, that it was just another curve in the road. He was never the type to dramatize or explode. He waited. And perhaps it was precisely this calm that unintentionally pushed him away. Laura wanted presence, but she also wanted to be surprised. She wanted routine, but she also wanted desire. And in this confusion of desires, she began to search outside for what she perhaps couldn't even name. Daniel wasn't naive. He knew the world offered no guarantees. But still, he kept hope alive that the love between them would be enough to weather any storm. Not because he thought he was better or more capable, but because he believed in daily choice. To wake up and keep loving. To love even through mistakes, even through silence. But love, however patient, also tires. And sometimes what tires isn't the absence of love, but the absence of reciprocity. Laura, deep down, still loved him. But she was lost within herself, shrouded in a fog of doubts that even she couldn't decipher. She began to wonder if she was still the woman she wanted to be, if she was still seen through the same eyes, if there was still a fire that hadn't been replaced by lukewarm affection. All of this happened in invisible layers. No major event marked this transition. There were no loud fights or sleepless nights. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible, but constant distancing. When Daniel looked at her, he still saw the woman he chose every day. But he began to realize he was no longer seen in the same way. The sparkle in her eyes now lit up in places he wasn't. The stories she told were full of details about people he didn't know. Her laughter sounded distant, as if it no longer included him. And yet, he held her tenderly every night, believing it was just a phase. There was something cruel in the way feelings died silently. Laura didn't want to hurt him, but she also couldn't fake an enthusiasm she no longer felt. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't want to pressure her, but he also couldn't ignore the emptiness growing between them. They were both trapped in a delicate dance, each step fearful of hurting the other, and ironically, it was precisely this caution that slowly shattered everything. The love that had once been a presence was now an effort. And when love becomes a solitary effort, it ceases to be a home and becomes a prison. And it was in this scenario of rehearsed silences, repeated routines, and stifled feelings that something began to brew in the invisible. Something that would change everything. That would unravel the foundation of the story they had so carefully built. Something that would show that, no matter how much we try to protect those we love, we can't stop them from making choices that hurt us. There were still no clear signs, no proof, no confrontation. But deep down, something had already begun to crumble. And even though neither of them knew it yet, their story was about to take an irreversible turn. And when that happened, what would be at stake would not only be the love between them, but how each would deal with the pain of realizing that love isn't enough when respect is lost. Because what would follow wouldn't just be a breakup, but a profound transformation. And for some, this kind of transformation comes too late. Daniel's routine followed the same silent rhythm as always, even when noises began to spread almost imperceptibly. He wasn't the type to investigate or suspect things in advance, but he began to notice small signs, subtleties that escaped distracted eyes but that gradually became annoying noises in his peace. They were messages that took longer to respond to, smiles that ended prematurely, constant distractions during conversations that had previously engaged her with such interest. Laura said she was tired, that her work commitments had intensified, that events were draining all her energy, but Daniel, with his attentive silence, sensed it wasn't just that. There was a kind of absence that wasn't physical, a distance that lived in her eyes, even when her body was still there beside her, lying in the same bed, drinking coffee at the same table, sharing the same spaces. What was being lost between them was deeper than the everyday could explain. Laura, for her part, tried to cling to an inner balance that no longer existed. There were nights when she lay next to Daniel and felt guilty just for breathing. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't stop the movement that took her further and further away from him. Her heart had split before she even realized it. The bond she had with Daniel was an old, comfortable home, but also silently suffocating in the face of everything she now felt. She was trying to justify to herself that she was confused, that it was a phase, that maybe she just needed some time. But deep down, she had already crossed an invisible line between desire and error. And she continued to cross it every day, without the courage to return, but also without the courage to leave for good. It all started with professional, cool, and well-placed messages. The new boss was intelligent, articulate, confident. He had the kind of presence that fills any room, that speaks with his eyes before he even opens his mouth. And Laura, who had always valued the freedom, autonomy, and energy of intense people, felt provoked in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. At first, she denied any involvement. She said it was just professional admiration, that she was simply enchanted by the way he handled things. But enchantment turned to curiosity, and curiosity turned to desire. All disguised as lunches with agendas, hallway conversations, glances exchanged too long to be accidental. Laura didn't plan anything, didn't premeditate what would happen, but she did nothing to prevent it either. And this omission was turning into betrayal even before the call. Daniel, as distracted as he tried to appear, could already sense the tension in the air, but chose to remain silent. Not out of weakness, but out of respect for what they had built. I still believed she was just tired, just overwhelmed, just needing space. But she didn't need space. She needed something else she couldn't yet name, but which she no longer found in Daniel's calm gestures. The boss, with his dangerous and seductive game, began to occupy the spaces that had previously been his. With sharp words, with surgical compliments, with a kind of attention that made Laura feel desired again, as if she still had something to prove, something to conquer. She tried to balance the two versions of herself, the woman who came home and cooked dinner with Daniel, and the one who lost herself in silent fantasies with another man, fantasizing about a freedom she perhaps didn't even truly desire. Guilt gnawed at her over the little things. Sometimes she hesitated before sending a message. Other times, she remained silent longer than she should have. And Daniel, increasingly attentive, increasingly restrained, collected these gestures like someone trying to put together a puzzle whose pieces no longer seemed to fit together. The tension between them was rising, but it was subtle, without explosions, without confrontations. Just averted glances, spared words, absences that had become commonplace. The relationship, once full of small surprises and complicities, was now a minefield of silences no one knew how to break. And it was in this dense atmosphere that Laura made the irreversible mistake. Dinner took place on a random Wednesday night. She told Daniel she had an extended meeting, something important, something unavoidable. He believed her. Or chose to believe her. He didn't ask for details. He wished her luck, kissed her forehead, and returned to the sofa. And she left, her heart heavy, but determined to cross a line that, until then, had existed only in her imagination. The restaurant she'd chosen was far from home, discreet, dark, the kind of place where no one asks questions. She arrived first, ordered wine, fixed her hair, and checked her phone with the screen locked. When he arrived, they exchanged no more than 3 words before the first ring. It was as if everything they'd been repressing finally exploded there, between one sip and the next. Long smiles, hands too close, glances that ignored the gravity of it all. Laura let herself go, as if that moment were a temporary refuge from guilt. She laughed more than she should have, drank more than usual, and spoke with a forced lightness about trivialities. The chef spoke of achievements, travels, possibilities, and she smiled with an excitement she no longer displayed at home. What she hadn't expected was that, on that very night, Daniel would decide to surprise her. There was no plan, no suspicion, just a burst of affection, an attempt to rekindle the connection. He went to the restaurant, driven by a simple idea, to give her a silly gift, some random souvenir. Maybe flowers, maybe just a hug. Something to say, "I'm with you," even without words. And when he entered the dining room, he saw her. Sitting. Laughing. With someone else. Her expression upon seeing him was a reflection of everything that had been happening between them for weeks. A contained panic, a disguised dread, an attempt to appear normal. But there was no hiding it. She stood still, and the boss pretended not to understand what was happening. Daniel said nothing either. He froze for a few seconds, stared at the scene, and then turned his back. He left slowly, unhurriedly, with the dignity of someone who understands, in that instant, that the end doesn't need to be announced with shouts. He knew. He knew he didn't need to ask anything. It was all there. Right before his eyes. Laura followed him out with uncertain steps, calling his name in the parking lot, but he didn't answer. He just got in the car and drove away. He didn't accelerate, he didn't yell. He left in silence, like everything he'd experienced with her in the last few weeks. And on that drive home, something inside him faded. It wasn't anger. It was grief. A deep, irreversible pain, like losing someone who's still alive. She returned hours later. She tried to explain, tried to deny, tried to grasp the crumbs of what was no longer there. But Daniel was distant. Sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, his eyes heavy with a pain that couldn't be put into words. She cried, pleaded, said loose phrases like, "It wasn't what you think," and, "It was just a one-time thing," and, "I still love you," but it all sounded like echoes of a time that would never return. Daniel didn't scream, cry, or curse. He just listened. In silence. And when she finished, he said he needed time. He went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and stayed there for hours. The betrayal was revealed. And with it, the certainty that love alone wasn't enough to sustain what had been broken. But there was something even deeper. Something Laura didn't yet know. A secret hidden behind Daniel's silence that would explain not only her restrained reaction but also the exact weight of what she had lost. Something that would transform not only their relationship but the way she saw herself. And that secret was about to come to light. In the dense silence of the following days, Laura tried in every way to break through the invisible wall that now separated them. She called, sent long, emotional messages, showed up unannounced, left notes, but nothing seemed to work. Daniel was present, but distant. It wasn't cold indifference, it was a carefully maintained absence, like someone keeping a deep pain in a secret, unreachable compartment. He didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't punish her with sharp words. He simply listened, observed, and responded with minimal gestures, as if no longer expecting anything. This serenity hurt Laura more than any outburst. She expected tears, accusations, anger. But she received silence. And that silence weighed a ton. Over time, she realized she was no longer the one setting the pace, nor the direction. For the first time, she wasn't in control of anything. And that was when the regret began to sting with real force. That night when she insisted on seeing him, Laura hoped to find at least a glimpse of the man who used to smile at her even on the hardest days. But Daniel was different. His eyes were darker, deeper, and there was a firmness in his voice she'd never heard before. He welcomed her into the living room, sitting in his usual armchair, but he didn't get up to embrace her. He simply asked her to say what she needed to, and then listened with painful attention. She poured out everything she had, her mistakes, her guilt, her longing, her regret, the words she hadn't known how to say before, the fear of having lost him forever. She spoke until she was breathless, tears streaming down her face and her throat trembling. When she finished, silence returned to the room like an unwelcome visitor. Daniel remained silent for a while, his eyes fixed on a random spot on the wall, until finally he stood and walked slowly to the bookshelf. He picked up a thick envelope, yellowed at the edges, and placed it on the table between them. He just said that she had the right to know what he had been carrying alone for so long, and that, after opening it, she would understand why there was no longer room for the two of them in the same future. Laura opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were letters, printouts of emails, and a small wooden box. She picked up the first letter and began to read. It was from her. A letter written 4 years ago, at the beginning of their relationship, in which she said she would never leave him, that he was the first man who made her feel safe, that if he ever left, she would die inside. The second letter was from him, in reply, written with a tenderness that now cut like a blade. The following letters were from someone else. A woman. A name Laura didn't recognize. Affectionate words, accounts of encounters, gestures of affection. For a moment, she thought she was reading evidence of his betrayal, something hidden, revenge perhaps. But then she realized the tone of those letters, they were confessions, outbursts, words written by someone in pain. The sender's name kept coming back, always accompanied by dates and medical records. Laura, confused, looked at Daniel, and then he revealed the story he had been keeping for years, and that now would change everything. Before they were together, Daniel had been in a relationship with a woman named Helena. They were together for a little over a year, and it was with her that he experienced the most transformative and also most painful experience of his life. Helena was sweet and intense, but she fell ill shortly after they started living together. An aggressive cancer, discovered at an advanced stage. For almost 7 months, Daniel cared for her day and night, giving up work, social life, and plans. She died in his arms, silently, after whispering that he deserved to be loved again. And that, when he was ready, he should allow himself to find someone who wasn't in a hurry. When he met Laura, months later, he still bore the scars of that grief. But he saw in her a light, a possibility for a new beginning. He never told anyone about Helena, not out of shame or secrecy, but because he kept that pain hidden. He believed that, little by little, he could leave the past where it belonged. The wooden box in the envelope was a gift from Helena. Inside was a simple necklace with a leaf-shaped pendant and a small letter in which she said it was the symbol of everything she had learned from him: patience, surrender, and love without guarantees. Laura held the piece between her fingers, in shock, her eyes welling with tears. Daniel then said that, even after so much suffering, he had believed he could experience a peaceful love with her. But now, after everything, he understood that perhaps life was teaching him not to expect from others the same kind of surrender he offered. He didn't speak with resentment. There was only the pain in his voice of someone who has been broken twice. The first by death. The second by betrayal. Laura tried to get closer, crying softly, saying she didn't know, that she would have done everything differently if she had. But Daniel didn't back down, nor did he come closer. He said their story had already been written. And that, no matter how hard she tried to start over, what was destroyed wasn't just love, it was the trust he'd once decided to rebuild after losing everything. He said the betrayal wasn't just with him, but with the memory of the promise he'd made to Helena to allow himself to be happy again. And that now, he understood that perhaps he'd broken that promise by trying to give himself over again without being completely ready. Laura, shocked, tried to argue, saying he couldn't compare pain, that she was suffering too, that the mistake was momentary, but their love was greater. But Daniel, with firm eyes, said that love needs truth, and that she, by hiding and lying, had left their love alone, without ground. The silence returned, and this time it was definitive. Laura understood he wouldn't return. That no matter how much she redeemed herself, asked for forgiveness, explained her reasons, there would be no reconciliation. Not because he was cruel, but because he was no longer there. Something in him had died along with the memory of that restaurant table, and there was no way to resurrect it. He thanked her for everything they'd shared, wished her the peace she sought, and walked her to the door. As she left, Laura felt a weight on her chest like never before. And for the first time, she truly grasped what she had lost. He wasn't just a good man. He was a whole man, who, even though hurt, had tried to love with everything he had. And she, out of impulse, insecurity, or ego, had traded all that for emptiness. After she left, Daniel sat in the living room and stared at the necklace between his fingers. He knew that, at that moment, a cycle was ending. That the pain he felt now was confirmation that he had given everything, twice. And yet, he had been left alone. But, unlike before, he was no longer afraid to start over. Now, the pain was no longer the end. It was the beginning of a new story. And he was ready to live it. Even if, this time, it was with someone I hadn't yet met. Even if, this time, love came slowly. Because now he knew exactly what he deserved. And I wouldn't accept anything less. Months had passed since that last conversation. Since the day Laura left the apartment with red eyes and a face marked by a silence that, for the first time, was hers. Daniel continued his life with the dignity of someone who knows the value of what he carries within. He didn't need revenge, spectacle, or confrontation. What he had experienced with her wouldn't be tarnished by shouting or humiliation. He kept every memory where it belonged, in the past. He returned to places he had previously avoided, reconnected with old friends, returned to work with greater dedication, and even allowed himself to smile lightly. He wasn't the same man he'd been before, he couldn't be, but there was a new space within him to be inhabited, and little by little, he filled it with things that made him feel good. He learned to cook for pleasure, resumed reading, rediscovered silence as comfort, not as a prison. He was a man rebuilding. And this time, completely. Laura, on the other hand, began to live between failed attempts to move on and an emptiness that seemed to cling to the walls of her routine. There was no reconciliation with her boss, not even any continuity in the relationship. He was blunt, he had no interest in anything beyond what had already happened. The rejection hit her with unexpected force, but what hurt most was realizing that what she had destroyed had been worth absolutely nothing. Returning to her old job became impossible. The environment was already contaminated by sidelong glances and whispers in the hallways. She resigned voluntarily, but deep down she knew she had been expelled by her own conscience. She moved apartments, cut her hair, tried to change the furniture, change cities, her habits, her company. But what wouldn't change was the weight she carried inside. She slept poorly, avoided mirrors, skipped birthdays, and withdrew from groups. Living with guilt means waking up with it, drinking coffee with it, working next to it, and lying in bed hugging it every night. And for Laura, the guilt wasn't just about what she did. It was about what she lost. One day, by chance or fate, the two met in a bookstore. Daniel was absent-mindedly leafing through a random novel when he heard her voice behind him, hesitant, as if carrying the weight of 100 uncertainties on his chest. He turned slowly, with the serenity of someone who no longer feels pain, but with the distance in his eyes of someone who hasn't forgotten. Laura wore a simple coat, no makeup, and her gaze held a humility she hadn't possessed before. They exchanged dry, restrained, polite greetings. She asked how he was, and he responded with a light, sincere smile that needed no adjectives. Laura said she still thought about him every day. That there wasn't a morning that went by that she didn't remember the sound of the coffee pot running, their Sunday walks, the way he looked at her as if there were no one else in the world. She said that, even after everything, she still carried the messages he wrote when she was late, the notes he hid in her books, the long hugs after difficult days. Daniel listened attentively, respectful, but without any inclination to relive the past. When she finished, he said he remembered everything too. But that he no longer missed it. Silence fell between them once more, this time amidst bookshelves and the gazes of strangers. Laura smiled sadly, murmuring that it was fair, that she understood, but before leaving, she asked him to hear something she'd never had the courage to say. He nodded, without expectation. And then she confessed that, after that night at the restaurant, she'd started having recurring nightmares. She dreamed of him leaving, his face stained with disappointment, his eyes, once a shelter, becoming cold mirrors of goodbye. She said the greatest punishment she bore was knowing she'd never again be looked at the way he looked at her. That she could find other loves, other arms, other promises, but none of them would bring the same peace. Daniel, his eyes brimming with tears, simply replied that no one deserves to live trapped in guilt forever, but that some choices have eternal consequences. And that there was no more hurt. Only the certainty that she'd made the wrong choice at the exact moment he loved her most. In the following months, Daniel met Sophia. It wasn't overwhelming, nor sudden. It was a quiet, almost unpretentious encounter at a cooking class he'd forced himself to attend to change his routine. Sophia was sweet but firm. She had a light laugh, but a look that recognized old pain without needing to ask. They talked about books, wine, movies, and travel. She never asked about his past, but she listened when he, one day, decided to open up about his story. There was no judgment, just silence and understanding. She told him she'd been through something similar and knew how hard it is to trust again after the ground has been broken. Daniel felt seen, not as a victim, but as a man. Someone who was whole, even with the scars. Over time, his relationship with Sophia blossomed. There was no urgency, no demands, no fear. There was respect, lightness, and presence. It was a love that didn't need to be shouted at, that didn't require daily proof, but was built in details. A coffee made without her asking. A shoulder massage at the end of a tiring day. A song shared while they cooked together. Daniel began to feel that, for the first time in a long time, he was truly at peace. There were no comparisons. What he experienced with Laura was part of his history, but it didn't define his present. He was ready to look forward, without the weight of what had been, only with the clarity of what he wanted. Laura, for her part, followed from afar, through their shared social media, fragments of his new life. Photos of trips, dinners, sincere hugs. Sophia beside him, silent but present. And it tore her apart. Because now she understood. It wasn't just Daniel she'd lost. It was the chance to be looked at with respect, to have a home, to be chosen every day, even on bad days. She saw the necklace he discreetly wore, the same one Helena had left behind. A sign that he would never forget the past, but also that there was now room for the future. Laura tried to rebuild herself. She met other people, went back to work, sought therapy, started writing. But his absence was a silence that couldn't be filled. A void that no new beginning could erase. Their final reunion took place in a small cafe, where they both entered unaware of the other's presence. Daniel was with Sophia. Laura was alone. When their eyes met, time seemed suspended for a brief second. Sophia, unaware of the full story, realized the weight of the moment. Daniel held her hand naturally but firmly, as if to say, "I'm here, now." Laura watched them with a melancholic smile, and in a gesture of maturity that carried all the pain she had learned to endure, walked toward them. She greeted them both, praised the atmosphere, and said she was happy to see them well. Daniel thanked them, introduced Sophia affectionately, and the three chatted for a few minutes. When Laura said goodbye, Daniel stood, walked her to the door, and before she left, simply said that he hoped she found the peace she so desperately sought. She smiled, held back tears, and replied that she was trying. And in that moment, with the door closing behind her, she understood, definitively, that some losses cannot be recovered. Returning to the table, Daniel took a deep breath. Sophia looked at him sweetly, without needing to ask anything. He smiled, caressed her hand, and silently thanked her for being able to move on. Because the greatest forgiveness someone can offer isn't in words. It's in the choice to carry on, even after being broken. And Laura, walking alone down the sidewalk, realized that she might spend her whole life trying to return to a place where there was no longer room for her. The punishment wasn't being left. It was knowing that he, even after everything, forgave her, and still chose to love someone else. And it was only there that she understood the true meaning of losing. The encounter in that small cafe became an invisible milestone between what remained of the emotional lingering and the definitive acceptance of the end. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, but its gestures and looks carried the weight of everything that had once existed and was now nothing more than memory. From that moment on, Laura understood irrevocably that there were no more bridges between them. There were no more gestures to be made, words to be said, or explanations to be given. Everything that needed to be exposed had already been laid out on the table, with pain, maturity, and silence. And what had once been hope hidden in every attempt at a reunion now transformed into a bitter recognition, she would no longer be part of his future, even though she carried the entire past within her. He began to walk that part of the city carefully, avoiding the streets that had once belonged to them both. It was as if every corner held a memory ready to remind her of what could no longer be touched. The songs they used to listen to together now made her nauseous, the movies they watched in each other's arms became forbidden territory, and even the smells, his perfume, the soap on his sheets, his breakfast, all these details haunted her with the cruel precision of absence. She wondered, with increasing frequency, where she had lost herself. When she stopped recognizing the man she shared Sundays with, when she began to fall in love with the idea of being desired by someone who wasn't part of her story. She tried to map the internal paths that led her to that dinner, as if understanding the trajectory were enough to ease the weight of the aftermath. She would wake in the middle of the night frightened, not by visual nightmares, but by the exact memory of Daniel's expression that night everything fell apart. It wasn't fury, it wasn't hurt. It was the end, etched in the eyes of someone who had given up, not for lack of love, but for an excess of dignity. And that image followed her everywhere. She began to write about it. Short, painful, unsigned texts. She published on anonymous blogs, created fictitious profiles, as if each word were a way of stitching together her own regrets. She received comments from women and men who had been through similar stories, and this created a kind of tragic relief in her heart, knowing that she was not alone, but also recognizing that everyone there had destroyed something that would never return. Daniel, on the other hand, allowed himself to rediscover joy without the weight of open scars. His relationship with Sophia grew stronger silently, without grand declarations, but with a healing constancy. It wasn't an urgent love, but a complete love, self-sufficient in simple gestures and peaceful routines. She didn't demand that he erase his past, and he, in turn, didn't demand that she be someone she wasn't. They found themselves in the midst of the emotional maturity and serenity of someone who had experienced enough pain to know that the most important thing was to be at peace. Memories of Laura no longer haunted him, but he still held them with the respect of someone who knows that forgetting isn't necessary to move forward. Every now and then, listening to some music that played during lazy mornings with her, he felt a slight, almost nostalgic pang. Not from missing the person, but from the innocence with which he believed nothing would shake them. This kind of loss leaves scars deeper than the absence itself, the loss of faith in absolute certainties. But now he was different. He had learned to trust without expectations, to love with abandon but without dependence, to no longer lose himself in the other as he had before. One rainy afternoon, while organizing some old books for donation, Daniel found a notebook Laura used to use. It was one of the few objects left from their time together, forgotten among piles of paper. He opened it out of curiosity, with no intention of dwelling on the past, but was surprised to find, tucked between the pages, a letter he'd never delivered. It was dated 2 days after the fateful dinner, handwritten in shaky handwriting and broken sentences. Laura spoke of regret, but in a different way than he'd heard before. In it, she didn't apologize. She simply admitted she didn't know why she did what she did. She wrote about an emptiness that had always accompanied her, a restlessness that no relationship could silence. She said he was the most loyal man she'd ever known, but that perhaps her own instability had been the reason she'd destroyed everything. There were no excuses, just an attempt to understand herself. Daniel read it to the end, carefully closed the notebook, and placed it in a box with other memories. It wasn't anger I felt, nor sadness. It was a silent acceptance that some stories serve to teach us about the limits of our surrender, and that not all love transforms us into better versions of ourselves. Sometimes, love simply reveals who we are, and we're not always ready for that. Meanwhile, Laura was beginning a phase of deep introspection. With Daniel's separation already firmly in place, she began to face her own life more honestly. He began regular therapy, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real dive into the shadows he'd avoided for years. She faced truths she'd always hidden from herself, the fear of rejection, the constant search for validation, the difficulty of remaining stable. She understood that her betrayal wasn't just a momentary choice, but a reflection of patterns she'd carried long before meeting Daniel. She began rebuilding her career in a different field, more focused on writing, where she could channel her pain into words that touched others. Her name began to circulate among blogs and small magazines. She was a writer without a face, but with a voice. And that was enough, for now. Her love life, however, remained on hold. She tried to open up, went out, met people, but something was always missing. She inadvertently compared herself, seeking in the eyes of others the acceptance she'd lost. The problem was that the kind of love Daniel offered her wasn't easily repeated. And this made her realize, day after day, that her mistake wasn't just betraying him. It was failing to appreciate the preciousness of what they had before it was lost. At one of these literary events where she was invited to speak anonymously, Laura watched the audience with a heavy heart. She knew many people there were being touched by stories of love, loss, guilt, and new beginnings. At one point, a woman stood up to ask a question and mentioned a specific story about betrayal and regret. She said it had made her apologize to her ex-husband after years of no contact. Laura simply smiled and thanked him, without revealing that she was the author of those lines. And there, she realized that perhaps, even without repairing what she had destroyed, she could still make something good from her own fragments. She began to view love with more responsibility, with more listening, with more surrender, even if it was too late to offer this to the man she had loved. Life went on, and with it came the awareness that some wounds don't close to heal, but to remember. Time, which once seemed like a slow enemy, now became an accomplice. Daniel and Sophia were planning a long trip. They wanted to see the sea together, discover new places, create new memories. It wasn't an escape, but a celebration of what they were building. He didn't speak of Laura, not because he wanted to forcibly forget her, but because his present was already too full to be overshadowed by old pains. He knew his healing process was complete because he could now speak of her with respect, but without emotion. Sophia was present, she was home, she was a choice. And Laura? Laura was a chapter read, understood, but already closed. On the last night before the trip, Daniel walked across the balcony of the apartment he shared with Sophia. He looked at the city lights and thought about how much he had changed. He thought about Helena, about Laura, about everything he had experienced, and felt a strange gratitude. Because all those stories, despite the pain, had shaped the man he was now. A whole man, who no longer accepted halves. Sophia appeared behind him, wrapped him in a hug, and whispered that she was happy they had found each other. He simply closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and returned the hug with the certainty of someone who no longer carried any unfinished business. Across the city, Laura was writing another column. This time, it spoke about what it's like to lose someone definitively, not through death, but through the other person's choice not to return. And for the first time, he managed to finish the piece without crying. There was pain, yes, but there was also peace. The peace of someone who has finally understood that loving someone doesn't give us the right to hurt them and then expect them to stay. And so, without much noise, their lives continued. Each with their own scars, achievements, and choices. But with one drastic difference, he moved on in peace, and she continued trying to forgive herself. The end, for some, doesn't come with noise, nor with a knock on the door. It settles in slowly, almost imperceptibly, between a gesture that is no longer returned, a memory that begins to hurt less, a decision that no longer requires the other. Daniel and Laura had ended everything that needed to be said between them, but even after firm words and silent goodbyes, life continued to play with the delicacy of unexpected encounters, unsent messages, and inadvertently shared glances. And it was in one of these involuntary encounters that Laura, for the last time, had the chance to be face to face with Daniel, not to try something, but to witness the irreversible distance between what they once were and what they had become. The bookstore where he was attending a book launch wasn't the kind of place Laura imagined seeing him again. She'd learned about the event by chance, through a mutual friend, and hesitated until the last second before deciding to go. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see him or if she simply wanted to confirm, with her own eyes, that he had truly moved on. When she arrived, she stood in the back row, half hidden between tall shelves, where she could see him in profile. He smiled kindly, hugged people, and spoke about the process of emotional reconstruction with light but firm words. He was more serene, more centered. He had the demeanor of someone who no longer expected approval or sought recognition. When he opened the floor for questions, a woman spoke about silent losses, and Daniel responded with the naturalness of someone who knows the weight of losing someone alive. He said that love doesn't end with the end of a relationship, but rather the moment we stop recognizing in the other what once completed us. And that sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing how to walk away without wanting the other to follow us. Laura felt her throat tighten, not because of the pain of no longer being by his side, but because she realized that, even absent, she was still the shadow most present in those words. At the end of the event, as the audience dispersed and Daniel signed some copies, she approached slowly. He saw her, recognized her immediately, but kept his gaze calm. She smiled with effort and said only that she had read his texts and that they were good. He nodded his thanks and asked how she was. She said she was fine, but there was a hesitation in her eyes, a silent request for more. Daniel didn't offer more. And Laura, respecting that already clear boundary, didn't insist. Before walking away, she simply said that she hoped one day she could forgive herself, and that, despite everything, she was grateful to have been loved by him. Daniel looked at her with a kindness that was no longer love, but a deep form of empathy, and said that forgiveness doesn't have to come before healing. Sometimes, it's the consequence of it. And then, with a barely perceptible smile, he turned to the next person in line, and Laura knew, once and for all, that this was the last page. Over time, Sophia realized that Daniel, despite being cured, was still marked by memories that shaped him. He wasn't jealous, he didn't ask too many questions, but there was a caring, almost protective sensitivity about her. In a conversation on a rainy Sunday, she mentioned that she loved his way of remaining silent in certain situations, and he explained that silence, for him, wasn't an omission, but a shield. A shelter he learned to use after having trusted too much in someone who didn't know how to stay. Sophia simply approached, touched his hand, and said she was willing to remain even in the silence. It was a simple phrase, but for Daniel, it was like breathing after a long time submerged. There, he understood that, even carrying ghosts, he could build something new without the past defining his next steps. Laura, in another corner of the city, was publishing a book with texts about love, loss, and consequences. She signed it with her full name for the first time. During the launch, she was asked what had motivated such depth in the texts, and she answered sincerely that the greatest lesson she learned about love was that it is not a promise, but a commitment. And that when a commitment is betrayed, what is lost is not only the other person, but parts of herself that will never be recovered. She received enthusiastic applause, but deep down, she knew those words were less about literature and more about confession. After the event, she sat alone in a coffee shop and thought about how things would have been if she had made different choices. Not as a way of torturing herself, but as someone who finally acknowledges responsibility for the paths she has taken. She no longer expected reunions or alternative endings. She simply wanted to move forward with the clarity of someone who has finally stopped lying to herself. Daniel and Sophia traveled for weeks, visiting places he'd always wanted to see and, for some reason, had always put off. They returned more connected, lighter. They decided to live together, not out of necessity, but out of desire. They didn't talk about marriage, children, or distant plans. They just wanted to continue walking side by side as long as it made sense. He never mentioned Laura again. Not out of resentment, but because life with Sophia filled every space with a naturalness that defied comparison. His previous experience had taught him the limits of patience and the weight of disappointment, but now, his peace no longer needed to assert itself in the face of pain. It was complete in itself. One afternoon, while visiting his parents, Daniel found an old photo tucked away in one of his forgotten childhood albums. It was of him as a boy, holding a piece of paper with the words, in crooked letters, "One day I'll be like Daddy." He smiled as he remembered his father always saying that being a man was much more than being right, strong, or successful. It was knowing how to protect what you love, even if it meant leaving. He thought about how that concept had guided him so many times, especially in his decision to leave Laura behind. He knew that if he had stayed, perhaps she would have loved him again. But never the way he deserved to be loved. And that clarity, today, was worth more than any memory. Laura continued her process of reconstruction, this time not trying to erase Daniel from her story, but inserting him into it as a memory deserving of respect. In a recent interview, she was asked what she learned most after so much time writing about loss. She answered, without hesitation, that the biggest mistake of those who love is to think that another's love is eternal by nature. That love is a constant choice, which needs to be nurtured not with grand gestures, but with respect. And that betrayal, even the most subtle, destroys not only love, but also one's ability to give themselves over again with the same brilliance. As she finished her answer, she looked at the interviewer, and for a second, her voice almost broke. But he took a deep breath and concluded that she learned all this too late. And that sometimes, the greatest punishment is becoming an expert on love after having lost the only true love one has ever had. That night, upon returning home, she wrote another column. This time, it wasn't about pain or guilt. It was about accepting that some stories break us so that others can be born. It was about Daniel, yes, but not as the man she lost, but as the man who taught her to never lose herself again. She ended the text with a simple sentence: "He was my final point. And thanks to him, today I know how to start over." After that, she closed her laptop, turned out the light, and slept for the first time without carrying ghosts beside her pillow. Life, despite everything, went on. And although she no longer had Daniel, she still had time, stories, and now, at least, the truth. Time has a silent way of putting everything in its place. The days follow like steady waves, and little by little, the densest feelings settle, the pain stops throbbing, and everything that seemed unbearable begins to be understood more clearly. The story of Daniel, Laura, and Sophia didn't end with grand announcements or dramatic endings, but rather with firm decisions, conscious glances, and, above all, with choices made silently. Each of them moved toward a destiny built by the consequences of their own actions, and when they finally arrived, there was no more room for disguised regrets or comfortable illusions. Only the truth, and that, however harsh, brought the freedom that no wounded love can sustain. Sophia was the first to recognize the moment when her and Daniel's story needed to take a bigger step. They had been together for almost 2 years, and despite living lightly, they knew that life offers no guarantees or eternal promises. They decided to marry in a small ceremony, surrounded by nature, surrounded only by people who were truly part of what they had become together. During the vows, Daniel didn't mention the past, but those who listened closely knew that every word he spoke came from a place of pain that had transformed into maturity. He didn't promise perfection, nor protection from suffering. He promised, with a firm voice, to be present even on the days when love wasn't enough to sustain everything alone. Sophia, with tears in her eyes, held his hand tightly and replied that she would be with him until the end of silence, until the end of fear, until the end of herself. The wedding wasn't a rebirth, but a serene continuation of what they already lived, a real, pure bond, where there were no hidden shadows or shallow promises. It was a simple but complete love. The kind of love that doesn't need to be constantly affirmed, because it's recognized in the routine, in the light touch, in the spontaneous gesture. Laura received the news of the wedding through a mutual friend. She didn't cry. She didn't run away. She didn't rebel. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and allowed the pain to pass without trying to stop it. She was no longer the woman who searched social media for signs of an impossible return, nor the one who used writing as a refuge for her guilt. She had matured painfully but firmly. Her career as a writer was growing, and her words now touched other women who, like her, had stumbled over their own pride and lost true loves. In lectures, interviews, and writing, she spoke with authority about what it means to build with someone and destroy with a single gesture. She became a reference on human relationships, not because she got it right, but because she spoke candidly about her mistakes. One of her most recent books reached the bestseller list with a strong and direct title, The Love I Destroyed. It was a disguised autobiography, but readers knew it. And, interestingly, this honesty reconnected her with parts of herself she thought she had lost forever. During a live interview, a journalist asked Laura if she still loved Daniel. There was a second of silence. She responded with a sad smile, saying that loving and deserving don't always go hand in hand. And that the love she felt for him today was made of gratitude, pain, and respect. She said that if she could go back in time, she would have made different choices. But that what had happened was necessary to transform her into someone capable of understanding love in a less selfish way. That interview went viral. Thousands of comments praised her courage in owning her flaws without victimization or romanticizing. But amidst all the praise, one specific comment made her pause. It was short, direct, and simply said, "I read every line knowing it was about me. I hope you're okay." She knew who had written it. And at that moment, she closed her laptop with a lump in her throat, without responding. Not out of contempt, but because sometimes silence is also a way of saying that everything is in the right place. Years later, Laura received an unusual invitation. A literary award in another country wanted to recognize her for her contribution to the literature of emotions and relationships. She traveled, accepted the award, and in her speech, she spoke not about herself, but rather about human choices. She said that the most serious betrayals are not always those committed with other bodies, but those we commit with our own conscience. And that her journey was marked not by losing someone who loved her, but by finally learning to love herself after destroying herself. As she left the ceremony, she was approached by a young woman in tears. She said she had given up on cheating on her partner after reading one of Laura's texts, and that she now understood that love isn't always lacking, sometimes, it's the courage to deal with it that we lack. Laura hugged her without saying anything. It was the most she could offer. It was all she knew how to give now. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophia continued to build a life away from the noise. They adopted a dog, moved into a house with a garden, and grew plants and told stories. Some nights, as he watered the leaves next to Sophia, Daniel reflected on how much life can surprise us even after so much pain. He no longer felt fear or insecurity. He trusted completely, not because Sophia was perfect, but because he had learned to respect himself before loving anyone else. This made him whole. In a quiet conversation over dinner in the backyard, Sophia mentioned that one day she would like to write about them. Not to tell the story of the love that began after someone else's betrayal, but to talk about how two people found each other after being torn apart by stories that almost made them give up. Daniel smiled and said that this was the most beautiful book he wanted to live, not write. The story of these three didn't end in pain or tragedy, but with hard truths, real losses, and profound learning. Laura never again related in the same way. She carried with each new encounter the responsibility of what she once failed to appreciate. Daniel, for his part, found peace, but not without having gone through everything he had. Sophia, even though she arrived later, wasn't a replacement, she was the right woman at the right time. The only one who welcomed him whole, when he had already understood who he was. And that's how this story ends. With each in their place. Not where they expected, but where life placed them after everything. One lost and learned. Another suffered but healed. And the third arrived and built, brick by brick, a love that didn't need to heal anything, it just blossomed. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment, share your opinion, and tell us what touched you most. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, emotional, real, and human. And don't forget, betrayal is never just a passing mistake. It carries profound, often irreversible consequences. It destroys families, commitments, and trust. It shatters those who truly love and turns love into trauma. Therefore, we make it clear, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Our stories exist to show what many only realize too late, that love, when it's true, doesn't require perfection, but it does require respect. And respect, once broken, can even be forgiven, but it is almost never rebuilt.